Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Pastor Ryan, and I'm just so glad that everyone can be here this morning. Everybody who's in the room and everybody who's watching online, I'm glad that you could be here as well. So we are starting a new series today. It's called The Wisdom and the Folly of Kings. And so what we're going to be doing in this series is we're going to be looking at some of the old kings in the Old Testament, and we're going to look at the ones who did a good job at following God and following his commands, staying true to him, who followed his wisdom, but then also some of the kings who decided that they're going to do their own thing. But before we really jump in today, there's a quote from Mark Twain that really stuck out to me, and I heard it once and thought it really described how I felt as a teenager. And he said, "When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in just 7 years." And I remember when I was a teenager, I thought, well, my parents just don't understand me. Like, I've got everything figured out. Like, I knew that I knew what I needed and what I wanted in life and where I was going to be going. But then as I got to be an adult, I realized how much I didn't know. I realized how much I still wish my parents would have been telling me what to do. Because when I got to be an adult, I realized life's hard to figure out. And when I thought I knew everything, things seemed so much easier. But really, my parents probably saved me from a lot. And so the wisdom and folly of kings, that's what we're going to be in over these next weeks. And some of the kings were like teenagers who thought they had everything figured out, were stubborn, decided they're going to do things their own way. And some realized that they needed to rely on God. They needed to trust him and follow his ways. But one thing we're going to be doing today is, before we jump in and look at stories of the kings, we're going to define what is biblical wisdom and what is biblical folly or foolishness. And so if you'll turn to Psalm 111:10, and we can understand what biblical wisdom is. In Psalm 111:10 says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. All who follow his precepts have good understanding. To him belongs eternal praise. And so a good definition for a biblical definition of wisdom would be to live and walk with God with a humble spirit of submission. To live and walk with God with a humble spirit of submission. Because wisdom isn't just about knowing God's ways. Psalm 110 said that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but it's not just knowing what God is saying, but understanding his word and following his ways. See, the fear of the Lord is something that we see all throughout Scripture, especially in the Proverbs. We hear about the fear of the Lord. But what does that actually mean? The fear of the Lord doesn't mean just actually like trembling in fear or just being afraid of him. It means that we have a reverence or an awe for him. It means we have respect for God. But that fear and awe and reverence and respect for him is coupled with obeying his commands. It's coupled with following his ways. And it's not that literal fear of being punished or trembling, but it's a deep appreciation for God's holiness and a deep appreciation for God's authority. And it's this type of fear that leads to wisdom and humility and love for God. And so wisdom isn't just understanding what God is saying. It's not just memorizing a few verses. It's putting God's commands into practice. It's about walking and following God. And it's about trusting him. It's about trusting what God is saying and trusting his commands to follow them. Dr. Henry Cloud wrote a book about trust, and one of the things he talked about when it comes to trust is that trust comes from 5 things. It comes from character. It comes from ability, track record, motive, and understanding. So it comes from the character. Does God have the character to show that he's someone we can trust? And the answer is absolutely yes. God's character shows that we can trust him. God has the ability to do what he says he's going to do. He doesn't just say things and not follow through. He's all powerful. He can and will do what he says he's going to do. God has the track record to show that he can be trusted. He shows that every time he says something is going to happen or says he's going to do something, his track record shows that he's trustworthy. He has the motive because he cares about what's best for us. And so we can trust him because we understand that God's motive is good, that he loves us and wants what's best for us. But God also has understanding. He created us. He knows who we are. He knows our hearts and our desires. And so he has an understanding of us and the understanding of every situation so that we can trust him. And so then we have to ask ourselves the question, will I walk in godly obedience to him? And will I trust him? Because it doesn't mean only understanding what God is saying. Wisdom means also following him. And so that's biblical wisdom. Biblical wisdom is understanding God's ways and following them. Biblical wisdom is trusting God, and following him and knowing that he is going to get us through. And then biblical foolishness or folly is refusing to do things God's way, and that comes from Proverbs 1:7. Again, this talks a little bit about wisdom. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And so biblical foolishness or folly is refusing to do things God's way. See, the problem is we often think we know better than God. We often think we know better than God. And I know as a teenager, there were a lot of times where I thought, man, I wish I'd listened to my parents. They were telling me something, and I thought they just didn't understand. They just didn't know what it's like to be a teenager in today's world, because things were so different when they were teenagers. But the reality is, they did have an understanding, and I should have listened to them. But the problem was, I thought that I knew better than them. And oftentimes, I think we treat God the same way. We know we can trust him, but often we think we know better. We know we're going to follow somebody else's wisdom or follow something that makes sense to us rather than trusting God. And so we have to ask ourselves, not only will I trust him, but also we have to ask ourselves the question, how and why are we tempted to walk foolishly? How and why do we sometimes do things our own way? Why do we often turn from God and do something that makes sense to us when we know we should be trusting God? And I think a lot of it has to do with how we view maturity. See, physical maturity means that as we grow older, we become more and more independent. When we're babies, we start out, we need to be fed. Our parents do everything for us. And then as we get older, we start to feed ourselves, and we start to dress ourselves until we're adults and we're doing everything by ourselves. That's what physical maturity is as we get older, as we become more mature, we become more independent. But spiritual maturity works in the exact opposite way. As we become more spiritually mature, we become less independent. And we become more dependent on God. As we become more spiritually mature, we realize we don't know what we think we know. We don't understand as much as we wish we understand. But we know that God does know and understand everything. And so the more spiritually mature we become, the more we become dependent on God. And so wisdom is following God's ways and putting his ways into practice. And if you would turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 8, this is where Samuel, who has been leading the Israelites, he's the prophet, he tells them what God has been saying. And he's been leading them, and he's getting old. And so his sons take over, but his sons aren't doing what they should be doing. They're not following God's ways. They're following their own ways. And so in 1 Samuel chapter 8, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel, so he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, "Listen to all the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them up from Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights." Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. He will assign some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be performers and cooks and bakers, and he will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants, your male and female servants, and the best of your cattle. And donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel heard all that the people had said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered, "Listen to them and give them a king." Then Samuel said to the Israelites, "Everyone go back to your own town." So Samuel had been leading the Israelites, and things had been going well, but now his sons weren't doing the job they were supposed to be doing, and there were other nations that were putting pressure on Israel. There were other nations who were threatening Israel, and they were preparing for battle, and the Israelites decided they wanted a king to lead them, to help them, and to lead them and to protect them from the other nations. And so the elders presented their request to Samuel, and they backed it up with a few arguments. They had the logic. They thought, well, we have this pressure from the outside, and your sons aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so they had the arguments as to why they should have a king. And so the elders asked, "Let's have a king. Let's be like all the other nations. We want to be like all the other nations and have a king to lead us." And this displeased Samuel, so he prayed about it, and God told him, "Yep, we're gonna give him a king." But God said, "It's not you they're rejecting as their leader." He said, God told Samuel that it's me they're rejecting as their king. And when Israel was asking for a king to be like all the other nations, they were forgetting that God was their king. They were forgetting that God was their leader, and so being different from all the other nations was actually their strength. Being different from all the other nations was actually a good thing. But they forgot that. They rejected God as their king, and they wanted God to appoint a king over them. And so God told Samuel to tell the people that, yeah, I'm going to give them a king, but I want you to warn them that it's going to cost them. There's going to be a high price for the king. And they're going to cry out and want to be delivered from their own king. But God said, I won't deliver them. I'm not going to listen in that day because I'm going to allow them to feel the consequences of their own choices. And so Samuel did. He told them that, yep, you can have a king, but the king's going to demand your sons and daughters. He's going to take the best of your fields, the best of your harvest, the best of your vineyards. He's going to take the best of your livestock and your animals and your donkeys, and he's going to give them to his attendants. It's going to hurt, but the people said, no, this is what we want to do. They were rejecting God's ways and rejecting God's wisdom. They were refusing to do things God's way and were doing things their own way. But we all have to remember that God is never surprised by what we do. Even when we reject his ways and turn away from him, he's never surprised by what we do. And he's not surprised, nor is he at a loss for what to do next. See, God knew that Israel was going to reject him as king and want their own king. And so he chose kings. And he chose Saul first and then David. But we can see that God's plans can't be interrupted by us refusing to follow them. Because eventually Jesus would be born from the line of David. And so we see that God's plan is always going to work to fruition. We can't mess that up. And even when we're following our own ways and acting foolishly, God is still in control. And so that is something that should always encourage us. But that doesn't give us permission to act foolishly. Because even though God's plan was still going to come to fruition, and it couldn't be messed up by Israel acting foolishly, it still really hurt. They still really felt the consequences of refusing to follow God. They really felt the consequences of following their own ways instead of God's. And so these nations were putting pressure on Israel. And they said they trusted God, but they wanted a king. They said that Samuel was a good leader, but it was their sons. They were following logic. They were following their own logic. But the reality is, when the pressure was on, it showed that they didn't really trust God. And when the pressure is on, we are tempted to take control. See, it's easy to say we follow God when things are good. When life's easy, it's really easy to say we trust God and we're following him. But then when that pressure's on, we are tempted to take control. And I think that's why a lot of times we decide that we know the right answer is to follow God, but often we turn to our own ways. And we still live and act foolishly. Because when the pressure's on, we want to take control. We want to take control because we trust God when things are easy. But when it's hard, we don't always understand that if he's going to lead us into something, then he's going to lead us through it. And we see this happened in 1 Samuel 12:12. Just a few chapters later, Samuel said that when you saw that Nahash, king of the Ammonites, was moving against you, you said to me, no, we want a king to rule over us, even though the Lord your God was your king. And so the pressure was on, and Israel decided they weren't going to follow God. They were going to follow their own ways. And that pressure, that stress, that shows us where our trust is. Because it's easy to say we trust God when things are going well. It's easy to trust God when we know things are going to turn out okay. But when the pressure's on, when the stress is on, that reveals where our trust is. Israel, when things were going well, they probably could have easily said, yeah, we trust God. He's our king. He's our God. We will follow only him. But when the Ammonites were moving against them, they very quickly tried to take control. They tried to do things in their own way. And so they acted foolishly. And so they were following their own ways. They were acting foolishly. They were putting their trust in themselves. They didn't trust God. But if we go back to 1 Samuel 8, Samuel, we can see that he trusted God. Because when the pressure was on, he prayed. 1 Samuel 8:6 says that when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. When Israel said, your sons aren't doing what they said they were going to do, they're not acting justly, Samuel felt the stress. He felt the pressure. But instead of trying to take control, Samuel prayed about it. Samuel prayed to the Lord because Samuel trusted God. See, when the pressure was on, Samuel prayed. And I know that that's something we all understand. From a young age, we understand that prayer should be our first thought when we feel pressure. We should always pray about it first. That's the Sunday school answer we all understand from a young age, but the reality is, how often do we actually do that? How often do we actually pray as our first response to feeling pressure or stress? And so, we always want to try and take control. We always want to try and pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. We always say that if we just keep at it, if we just keep working hard, just keep moving forward, we'll eventually get whatever we need done. Get through whatever is stressing us out or wherever the pressure is. But do we actually sit down and pray about it first? Is that what we actually do? Or do we try and take control? And so the bottom line today is that we need to give up control and ask for wisdom. We need to give up control and ask for wisdom. We need to pray about it first. We need to follow God, his ways, and his wisdom. Because as we continue through this series, we'll see kings who did give up control and ask God for wisdom, and they followed his ways. And we're going to see kings who tried to do things their own way, who acted foolishly, who listened to others rather than following God. But we need to give up control and ask for wisdom. And James, he talked about wisdom. And in James 1:5, he said, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. See, James said that if you need wisdom, just ask, and God will give it to you. And when he said this, he was comparing the people who were doubting and the people who were struggling in their faith and were doubting and weren't putting their trust in God. And he compared them to someone being tossed around by waves in the sea, someone who is up in the high and feeling good one minute, but then down in the low and ready to give up in the next. And I think all of us feel that way at some point in our Christian walk, where we go to a conference or we really hear God speaking to us, and so we're feeling really good, we're feeling really close to him. Like, yep, we're going to put our trust in God and we're going to follow him, but then we kind of fall away a little bit and we kind of lose that high. We feel down and we stop trusting God and start putting our faith in ourselves instead. And James was saying, no, ask for wisdom, and God will give it to you. He gives generously those who ask for wisdom. And so all you have to do is ask, and that will help a lot. He talks about double-minded faith and how we'll say yes one minute and no the next. We'll be high one minute, low the next. We'll be ready and willing to turn to God one minute, but then putting our faith in ourselves the next. But James says, ask God for wisdom, and God will give it to you. When Peter saw Jesus walking on the water, and he walked out to Jesus, when his eyes were fixed on Jesus, things were going good. When he was putting his faith in Jesus, he was fine. But then all of a sudden, he took his eyes off Jesus. He got worried about the wind and the waves, and he started to sink. And James says, ask for wisdom. Put your faith in God, and that won't happen. He doesn't say we won't feel the pressure. He doesn't say things will go easy for us if we put our faith in God. But he says if we keep our faith in God and keep our eyes on him, he'll give us the wisdom, and he'll help us get through. See, a lot of times we are like something floating in the waves. We're up one minute and down the next, tossed back and forth. But if we put our faith in God and trust him and follow him, God says that he will help us to get through. I'm going to close today with this little story that I had heard. So this businessman got on a plane, and he's used to flying all the time. So he got on the plane and sat down at his window seat. And then in the middle seat, there was this little girl who seemed to be flying alone, but she sat down in the middle seat, probably about 5 or 6, and then on the other seat was another businessman who flew all the time. So it's routine. They take off. Things are going well. Then the pilot comes on and says, that we're going to be flying through some turbulence, so it's going to get shaky. So everybody make sure you're seated with your seatbelts on. And so the businessman, used to flying, used to some turbulence, not too worried about it, buckles his seatbelt and kind of goes back to doing what he was doing. Well, the turbulence gets really bad. It's a really bad storm. It's a lot worse than anything the businessman had experienced before. So he's getting really nervous. And it feels like he's being tossed around, but all the while they're dealing with this turbulence. The little girl's just sitting in her seat, calm as can be, just not worried about the storm or the turbulence or anything at all. Well, eventually the plane makes it through the turbulence, and the pilot comes back on and says, "Thank you for your patience. We're through the turbulence. We should have a smooth flight the rest of the way." And so this businessman, he was worried about the turbulence, and he turns to the little girl and asks, "How were you so calm during the storm, during the turbulence?" She said, "Well, my dad's the pilot. And I know he won't take me into anything that he can't fly me out of." And it's the same way with God. Yes, there's going to be pressure, there's going to be stress. And it's easy to trust God when things are going well. But when there's that stress and that turbulence, we need to continue to trust him, because God won't lead us into anything that he can't lead us out of.